Call on here, Alhaji Mustafa BIntube, / Professor I.N. Sada. If you are here, please, can you come forward? Thank you, sir.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to this joint workshop of the funding and legislative cohort of the National Al-Majiri Summit, which is inshallah due to come in Q1 of 2021, first quarter of 2021. Before I go further, I would like to welcome Professor Issa Husseini Marte, the Chief of Staff of His Excellency Governor Babagana Zulum of Borno State, who would have liked to come here himself, but unfortunately, due to other circumstances beyond his control, he sent his able and indefatigable Chief of Staff, who is a professor of pharmacy and pharmacology, who happens to be a schoolmate. He was my head boy, and I was his senior prefect. What is this Al-Majirji system? In a nutshell, these are scholars who migrated in search of Islamic knowledge, especially Quranic knowledge. They are learners, they are not beggars. It is the society that slowly and systematically let them down. Today, you can see, this is the image of the Almajiris, looking dejected, looking dejected, desolate, despondent, hungry, and you can even add angry at the same time. So it is a scar on our collective conscience. None of us would like to see your near relations, not to talk of your children, in this living like this. And these vulnerable, unfortunate children also have fathers, they have mothers, they have sisters, they have uncles. So it's a shame. Now, how did this happen? To answer this, I would like to quote the then Waziri of Katsina, and who said, indeed, up to the 1928 Native Authority reforms, Arabic and Ajami writings were used in northern Nigerian administration, with British personnel trained in Arabic at Morocco and Sudan posted to Nigeria as interpreters. In fact, the Al-Majiri education system was a civilizing agent that was second to none before it was gradually replaced by a Western educational system and phased out by colonialists, and finally neglected by the local democratic, in quotes, and military leadership. So that's what happened. How were they catered for before this degeneration? Here I would like to quote late El-Miskin, may Allah forgive him, yarhamuhullah. And this is what he said, the Al-Majirji system and how it was catered for and funded before it degenerated to this system. He said, the center of learning that emerged as a result of imparting these Quranic and other sciences were never starved of their subsistence needs. On the whole, they were supported by caliphs, that is like the governments of today, or the work system, and wealthy individuals. Scholars were commissioned and schools were found to spread the sciences inspired by Islam without pushing these scholars and their support team to the precipice of destitution, let alone bowl flashing in search of subsistence, that is barra. The next question is, then why are we here today? What's the reason for being here? In a nutshell, we're here to carefully analyze how the Quranic education for young pupils was financed in the past, particularly the use of zakat, waqf, and habs, etc. Number two, to estimate the funding requirements of qualitative Quranic education and models in our contemporary times. Number three, to carefully analyze different funding mechanisms and to come up with viable and sustainable funding models in addition to the traditional zakat, waqf, etc. And lastly, to select the most promising funding models and develop detailed proposals towards actualizing them. The funding model is the fulcrum of the success of the overall Al-Majiri initiative. So the funding model is the fulcrum of the success of the overall Al-Majiri initiative. However, funding will not come in sustainable and reliable manner if the rules of the games are not clearly defined. And this is where the legislative cohort of the National Summit comes in. We have my friend, Professor Naia Sada, an erudite professor and legal luminary, as the chairman of the cohort. And inshallah, you'll soon hear from him about the legislative issues. To drive home, I'm sorry I didn't recognize the Managing Director and Chief Executive of Jais Bank, Mala Hassan Usman. He's sitting there. Just to drive home the interconnect between funding and legislation, I would like to recall our experience, if you remember, way back in 2008 when we were raising the capital of the bank. We got one of the successful Islamic banks in the Middle East to be interested in investing in Jais Bank, and they got their board's approval. And they wrote to our directors and shareholders that they were ready to invest $150 million. They got their board approval, but the approval is subject to enhanced due diligence, and that includes legal due diligence, corporate governance, et cetera, et cetera. They engaged an international lawyer, and the first thing to do was to look at the legislation involving the rules and regulations of Islamic finance in Nigeria. What rules, supervisory framework has the central bank created? Unfortunately for us, at that time, the supervisory and regulatory framework for Islamic banks was not created by central banks. And unfortunately, that was the deal breaker. We lost $150 million. Even today, Jais Bank, thanks to Mala Hassan and his team, is recording success upon success. They are listed on the stock exchange. But the capital up to now, the paid-up capital, including reserves, is still way, way behind the $150 million. Just to emphasize that funding and legislation go together. So I think on a lighter note, with this challenge of funding and legislation, I think the Almajiri bugs, when I say bugs, B-U-G-S, have no hiding place today. And why do I say that? Because we have two very accomplished and successful pharmacists and pharmacologists. We have Dr. Usman Bugaje here, and we have Professor Isa. So I hope by the end of today, we'll have a vaccine for Al-Majiri's bugs as well. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. You are most welcome once again. Thank you very much.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Let me once again welcome each and every one of you, those who are physically here and those who are joining us on at the electronic level. I think what would be useful is to give a background to the National Summit on Al-Majirji. And the first and most important thing to remember, and many of you here will be able to recall, there has been several attempts by several institutions, groups, organizations to resolve this disturbing phenomena of wretched-looking children all over the streets, begging for alms, all in the name of Quranic education. It's something that is an eyesore, it's something that has bothered so many people over a very long time. And some of you here have been involved in the last 25, 30 years in trying to see how can we resolve these issues. There has been conferences, there has been papers presented, there has been service done, there has been a number of attempts. Yet, in the last 20, 30 years, there has not been much in terms of what to show for all these efforts. So in the last 2 years, we started saying, look, there must be something that we are not doing right. Because while there are a number of organizations and the number is increasing, Al-Majiri rights initiatives, Al-Majiri soccer, Al-Majiri this, Al-Majiri that, and some state governments, through legislation, through the creation of Arabic and Islamic boards, UBAC with its own provision, yet nothing has really changed. If anything, over a period of time, things have actually worsened. So we said, no, we have got to find a way around it, because so many other countries that have inherited the same Islamic traditional educational system have transformed their own system to something that is very effective. Countries like Turkey, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Sudan, Morocco, mention them, they have all been able, even Senegal here, they've been able to transform their schools, their Islamic educational system, into something useful and practical. And you don't find children roaming the streets like they do in this part of the country. And some of you might be interested to know that the current president of Turkey, Erdogan, was actually a product of a reformed Al-Majiri school, what they call the Imam Hatif schools. They transformed them. He went into that school. When he graduated, he joined the mainstream. He went to Polytechnic. He started work, in the municipality. He became a labor leader. And from there, he graduated. He became the mayor of Istanbul. And then he went into proper politics, and now he's the president of Turkey. Meaning, if we reform our schools, those who go through, and this is why you may have seen clips of him in the mosque reciting the Quran, because that is the basic education that they receive at that primary level. A lot of them you find are huffaz, are people who have memorized the Quran, and yet they are engineers, they are medical doctors, they are social scientists, and it doesn't stop them. It only enhances their ability to do what other people are also capable of doing. So we thought the most important thing is for us to see how can we bring everybody on one single platform, instead of allowing everybody to do his own thing on his own platform in a very uncoordinated manner. How can we bring everybody and create coordination and synergy so that there will be impact on what we are doing? And we started this about 2 years ago, and a few months back, we put together our thoughts and we came up with this plan to have an national summit on Al-Majirji. And we decided to do it at 3 stages. The first stage was the stage of research and collation of information. So we got a team of researchers who worked for nearly 3 months and more, and there are still editorial teams working to find out anything that has been written on Al-Majirji. It could be proceedings of a conference on Al-Majirji. It could be in the archives, old files, policies, legislations, theses, dissertations, online, offline, archives, wherever, books that have been produced, wherever there is anything written on Al-Majirji, whether it's in Nigeria or outside Nigeria, we wanted to bring every available knowledge that is there on earth that we can bring together. And this we have done successfully. It's a huge amount of resource that is being sifted, organized, classified, so that we can come up with something that can make an easy reading and easy sense. Work is still being done, but the collection has been done, and we were amazed at the volume of material that is out there, so that we can build on existing wisdom, so that we don't have to reinvent, the wheel or start something that has already been done by others, perhaps better. So this, I think, is something that has not been done before, because we have got to find, new ways of approaching this problem. So this first stage we have already accomplished, even though the product are still being organized in ways that can be presented. And this will be available at the national summit that is going to come up, like Alhaji Mustafa has said, sometimes in the first quarter of next year, inshallah. The second stage is to disaggregate the complex issue of Al-Majirji. It's an issue that has a number of key components. There is ignorance, there is poverty, there is neglect of the state, of its own responsibility. There are a number of other issues. Therefore, we put heads together and came to 5 key components. One of them is curriculum. What is it that is going to be taught? Not only the Quran, which is the key factor, but you have to bring some kind of tarbiyah, something that will inculcate the values of Islam in the children. You have to also think of numeracy. You have to think of literacy. You have to think of skills. So how do you bring these key elements into a single curriculum and do it without allowing the Quran itself to suffer? So this is, something that requires a lot of expertise. And we brought in experts, and we call the group cohort because they are a group of experts coming together. So we formed a cohort on curriculum. Similarly, we looked at the aspect of logistics and models, where you have the learning environment. How is it going to be? What is it that we can make out of what we have? You have to look at the water and sanitation. We have to look at the psychosocial support that young children will require. You have to look at so many other things. So we formed a cohort on a cohort on models and logistics. This is the second component. The third, we looked at advocacy and parental responsibility. This is because we need to do a lot of advocacy to address the ignorance that is associated with the Al-Majirji at the level of parents, at the level of scholars, at the level of even public officers themselves. Let them understand what it's all about. And also we have to emphasize and do advocacy on parental responsibility, because the source of this scourge is actually parental irresponsibility. The children at the age of 3, 4, 5 are being taken away from their mothers, and being thrown out on the street. And this is something that no responsible society will allow, to happen. But then we have to address the psyche of the society. So we brought in a cohort on advocacy and parental responsibility, and of course the cohort on legislation, so that we can review all the existing legislations and see how we can bring this in line. Thank you. And then we moved on to the cohort on funding, which is what we have now, because we have to find out the funding. So we look at the capacity of zakah, of hubus, of waqf, of corporate social responsibility, of crowdfunding, and all the modern ways and methods of bringing about funding so that this issue will be addressed adequately. We have the capacity to be able to do this. What we have not done before and which we are doing now is to bring everybody with any idea, it doesn't matter how small, to put them all on one single platform. So this is the stage we are, the second stage. We have already done, as you will hear in the reports that Bashir is going to give, we have done 3 workshops, and we are combining 2 workshops here today, the one on funding and the one on legislation. And the idea is these workshops, a lot of the work has already been done by the group of experts, but they are bringing it out here so that people can now, they can do some kind of validation. They bring it out and they invite others to look at it again and to add value to what they have done. And it is after these workshops, the results of whatever has come out of this engagement is what is going to the third and final stage, and that is the stage of the National Summit. And the idea of the National Summit is to bring in all the stakeholders, the ulama, the traditional institutions, citizens that care, especially senior citizens, academics, lawyers, bring in the National Assembly, who have a responsibility for both legislation and appropriation to bring about the necessary funds that this education system will require, to bring in the executive arm of government also, to bring in everybody who has a role to play. And the idea of that summit is to present the work of these workshops, but more importantly, to also assign responsibilities. We will, maybe the first day would be a day when we'll present all the work that has been done in the last 6 months or so, but the second day we'll be able to pin down specific responsibilities. The National Assembly, we have got a responsibility to do the correct legislations and to appropriate funds appropriately, because we have got to look at that segment, with all the information and data that has been generated. You'll be able to see the scale, you'll be able to see the challenge, you'll be able to put something that is commensurate to the scale and the challenge. The state governments also are going to be involved, and at the end of it, we will walk out of that summit knowing exactly what each person or each institution or each segment is going to do. And we will make this summit to be an annual event thereafter. There will be a permanent office that will do monitoring and evaluation, and every year there will be a summit. This time it will now say, okay, National Assembly, last year you have been asked to do specific 1, 2, 3 things. How far have you gone? Have you delivered? If you haven't, why have you not been delivered? Do you need some help from anybody? Okay, the ulama, you are supposed to do this. Have you done that? This is something that we are determined and want to mobilize the whole country to this. So if you have any idea of how to help, don't stay out there doing your little bit. Come into the big platform. Make your own contribution. That doesn't stop you from doing whatever you are doing, but it brings in that experience, that ability, that insight, that resources that you have, so that we all together, can create the synergy, the coordination, the focus that is necessary to overcome. And we're not going to leave anybody out of this. And no effort is too small. Anybody who has any idea should come in. There is space for everybody, but then we are going to monitor and we are going to keep everybody on his toes for the next 25 years until we get this thing sorted out. I know we have pressure for time, but permit me to make a few clarifications. Too often, when we come to discuss this issue of Al-Majirji, even among Muslims, there is lack of clarity as to why this educational system has come and what has happened and why we are having this, and how does that relate to the routine or the mainstream educational system that you find around the world. So I want to make a few clarifications. First, this educational system, that is now seen in the Almajiri, was an educational system that Islam established over 1,000 years around the world. And it is the educational system that actually helped the world to be where it is today. And I'll come back to that. What has happened was that during the colonial period, and it's not just Nigeria, most colonized societies, the colonial interest at that time was to suppress this education and to promote the Western secular educational system. It was a colonial enterprise. And therefore, deliberately, this system of the traditional Islamic education system was deliberately supplanted and weakened and ignored. So those who went to secular schools, who came out to become the new managers after the colonial masters left, they became the ministers, so they were formulating policies, they became the managers, they became the administrators, they became those that appropriate funding in parliament, were all, if you like, oriented to promote the Western education above this particular educational system. And this is why this thing has been abandoned. So even the term that is often used as out-of-school children, strictly, the Almajiri is not an out-of-school child. He is in a school which the colonial enterprise refused to recognize and supplanted deliberately. So we need to correct that. We need to understand that it was an educational system, which was like any other educational system, that has been neglected, and that's why we are where we are. And all we need to do is to bring it up at par with others. And in any case, it's not contradictory to the mainstream educational system. And this is the point I wanted to come back to. The mainstream educational system, which we inherited from the West, was itself at the beginning a product of the Islamic educational system. If you look at the intellectual history of Europe, you know that Europe was in the Dark Ages until the 16th century. And that's the beginning, of the Renaissance, what is called the Renaissance. And during the Dark Ages, Europe, if you read the literature, and you don't have to go very far, even if you read Shakespeare and some of these literary figures, you will see how superstitious, how backward these societies were. They were not educated, they were not literate. But then they started to become aware, and that's why they call it the Renaissance. Now, the heroes of the Renaissance, people like Dante Alighieri, people like Voltaire, people like, these are people who came even before the major 16th, 17th, 18th century philosophers, were all people who were influenced by teachers, Islamic educational system. And you don't have to go too far. I mean, there is a work by one George Makdisi, who did a PhD on the history of colleges and universities in the West. And he established beyond reasonable doubt, with empirical evidence, that all the universities that we are now hearing and very proud of, Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, UCLA, all these, if you look at their statute, you will find that they are basically different versions of the statute that established the Islamic universities. And if you go into history, if you Google the first university in the world, you will find that it was the Qarawiyun University that was established in 859 in Fez. And if you go to Fez today, you will find that university still standing. The next university is the University of Al-Azhar that was established in 970. The next university, that's the third university, is that of Timbuktu. That was established in 989. And the first university in Europe, in the West, was the one in Bologna in 1088. Bologna is a city below Florence in Italy, because the Renaissance started in Italy. And if you look at the work of Dante Alighieri, the Divine Comedy, which is a big classic in Europe, you will see that it is very much like the work of Ibn al-Arabi, who was a Spanish Muslim Sufi. So I want Muslims to understand that what the West claims to be was actually triggered by Islam. Even St. Thomas Aquinas, who is a huge intellectual figure in the West and in the religious circle, was influenced by Imam al-Ghazali. His critique of Aristotelian philosophy was something that he got from al-Ghazali. So these connections are there. So let us please understand that Islamic education triggered Renaissance and helped, and there are a lot of books now written. Even baccalaureate, which is the French, which we call bachelors when you give, degree, has been traced back to the a certification process of Islamic education. When you finish and you are given an ijaza, some of the terms used is that, bil haqq riwaya, you now have the right to actually relate that knowledge to others. That's how baccalaureate, came. So everything that is there has its roots in Islam. Of course, what happened was that when the Renaissance went to its own zenith, the West went to what is called the Enlightenment age. And there was this break between knowledge and God. And this is the beginning of secularism in the West. And that is the element that Muslims will find disagreeable, or even Christians will find disagreeable. So I've taken too much time. I'm sorry if I have to, but I feel it's an opportunity for us to realize that Islamic education is the root of all the kind of modern education that you can, and you can trace it. The history is there. In fact, Al-Maqdisi, George Maqdisi, is a Palestinian Christian who wrote this thesis, said in the 14th, 15th century, a scholar in the Renaissance period will not be taken to be a scholar unless he has books in Arabic in his library. In other words, you have to show that you have got roots too. And they have to put a few words of Arabic time and again to remind their audience that they are well grounded, just like some people do with English now, isn't it? So the point is, let us know, where these problems are coming, and let us see how we can address them collectively.